The house smelled like him still. That was the first thing Petra noticed when she walked back through the front door at 6 in the morning. Not the silence, not the cold air from a window someone had left cracked open, not even the faint echo of her own footsteps on the hardwood. It was his cologne. Cedar and something sharper underneath, the kind of scent that used to make her lean into his shoulder on Sunday mornings. Now it made her stomach turn. She set her keys on the kitchen counter and stood there for a moment, just breathing. The coffee maker was clean. The sink was empty. Everything was exactly where she'd left it 2 days ago when she drove herself to her sister's place in Oakville, with a duffel bag and shaking hands, telling herself she just needed a night away to think. She'd taken 3. Her name was Petra Halverson, 38 years old, senior financial analyst at Meridian Capital in Toronto. She'd put Garrett through his MBA, helped him land the position at Whitmore & Cole, ironed his shirts the morning of every important client meeting because he said he could never get the collar right. She'd done all of that while managing her own caseload, running their household budget, and quietly, privately, learning to make herself smaller in rooms where he seemed to need more space. She'd thought that was just marriage. What it looked like after the first few years, when the shine wore off and real life pressed in. She hadn't known there was a woman named Brianna. She found out the way most women find out. Not through a private investigator, not through anything that gave her even a moment to brace herself. She found out through a phone notification she wasn't supposed to see. It was a Tuesday. She'd been sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop, working through a projection model for a client presentation. Garrett had left his phone charging on the counter and gone upstairs to shower. The screen lit up. Miss you already. Last night was everything. Petra didn't move for a long time. She just looked at it. The name read only B in his contacts. She would find out later, after she unlocked his phone with the passcode she'd known for 6 years, their anniversary date, which she found grotesquely funny in retrospect, that there were over 400 messages. Going back 11 months. 11 months. Their daughter Nora had just started kindergarten 11 months ago. Petra had been coordinating school pickup schedules and packing lunches and worrying about whether Nora was making friends, and the whole time Garrett had been texting someone named Brianna Solano. She put his phone back on the counter, exactly where it had been, screen down. Then she went back to her laptop and finished the projection model. She didn't cry until she was in the shower at 11 that night, with the water running hot enough to hurt. And even then it wasn't the kind of crying she expected. It wasn't grief, exactly. It was something more like recognition, like a word she'd been trying to remember for months had finally surfaced, and it was uglier than she thought it would be. She didn't say anything to Garrett that night, or the night after. She needed to think, and she'd learned over the years that thinking out loud around him was dangerous. He had a way of turning her words back on her before she'd finished saying them, of making her doubt whether she'd actually seen or heard what she thought she had. He called it being rational. She'd spent years calling it that too. But she wasn't going to give him the chance this time. The day after she found the messages, she called her friend Daphne Okonkwo, who was a paralegal at a family law firm on King Street West. Daphne picked up on the second ring, and Petra said, "I need to know what I'm doing before I do it." Daphne was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Then she said, "Can you come in Thursday?" Petra went in Thursday. She sat across from a lawyer named Russell Tate, calm, methodical, the kind of man who listened without filling silences, and she explained the situation in the same tone she used for client presentations. The marriage. The mortgage on the house in Etobicoke, the investment accounts, some of which she had built and managed herself. Nora, 5 years old, currently enrolled at Bloordale Primary. Russell Tate took notes and asked quiet questions, and at the end of the meeting he said, "You've been thoughtful about this. That's going to matter." She drove home and made dinner and sat across from Garrett while he talked about a new client account, and she nodded and passed the bread and thought, "I am going to be okay." For 3 weeks, she gathered. She was careful. She'd always been careful. It was the thing Garrett sometimes complained about, that she moved too slowly, thought too much, wouldn't just decide. But now it was her sharpest tool. She made copies of financial documents. She photographed statements. She noted deposit patterns in their joint account that didn't match what he'd told her about his bonus structure. She documented the nights he came home late, the weekends he claimed were work trips, the way Nora had started asking why Daddy never put her to bed anymore. She didn't do it with anger. She did it the way she'd always approached complex problems, methodically, without sentiment, breaking a large thing down into its component parts until she understood all of it. What she found underneath the infidelity was worse than the infidelity. Garrett had opened a personal account 8 months ago that she hadn't known about. Money had been moving into it from their joint investments, not large amounts, nothing that would trigger an automatic alert, but consistent, steady. Over 8 months it added up to just over $42,000. When she brought this to Russell Tate, he set down his pen very slowly. "Did you authorize any of these transfers?" "No," she said. "And your name is on those investment accounts?" "Yes." He looked at her for a moment. "Petra," he said, "I think we need to talk about a few additional things." She took Nora to her sister Wendy's house on a Friday afternoon, told Nora they were having a sleepover adventure, watched her daughter run into the backyard with her cousin without a backward glance. Children are resilient, people always said. Petra used to find that phrase trite. Now she held on to it. She drove back to the house. Garrett was supposed to be at the office until 6. She had 2 hours. She took what she needed. Not everything. Russell had advised her against anything that could look like asset concealment. But the documents, the laptop with her personal files, Nora's baby photographs, that lived in a box on the top shelf of the linen closet, because Garrett had never bothered to scan them. Her grandmother's ring, the folder she'd been quietly assembling for 3 weeks. She left everything else exactly where it was. She left his dinner in the fridge with a note that said, "Had to take Nora to Wendy's. Back tomorrow." Not a lie, not the whole truth, just enough. She drove to Oakville with her duffel bag and shaking hands, and she did not look in the rearview mirror. Garrett called that night at 8:30. She let it go to voicemail. He called again at 9. At 9:45. She sat on her sister's couch with her knees pulled up and read a picture book to Nora 3 times until Nora finally fell asleep, and then she sat in the dark and listened to the messages. The first one was mild, slightly confused. "Hey, just wondering where you are. Give me a call when you get a chance." The second one was irritated. "Petra, I've called twice. This is a bit much. Just let me know everything's okay." The third one was different. Something in the texture of his voice had shifted. Not concerned. She knew the difference between Garrett concerned and Garrett calculating. This was the latter. "Look, I don't know what's going on, but if you're upset about something, we can talk about it. Just come home." She noticed he didn't say "come home" like it was an invitation. He said it like it was an instruction. She put her phone face down on the cushion beside her and went to bed. She didn't go back the next day. She called Russell Tate Monday morning and said she was ready to file. He wasn't surprised. She had the sense that he'd been waiting for her to arrive at this moment since their first meeting, not impatiently, just with the steady readiness of someone who knows where a road leads. The papers were served to Garrett at his office on a Wednesday afternoon at 2:15. Wendy told her later that he'd called the house 3 times that evening. Petra was already in a meeting with Russell, going over the financial disclosure requirements. She didn't step out. What she hadn't expected, or maybe what she had expected but had hoped was wrong, was how quickly he moved to Brianna Solano's apartment. 3 days after the papers were served. He didn't even wait a week. He showed up on a Saturday to collect some of his things, and when Petra came to the door with Russell's number already pulled up on her phone, Garrett looked at her like she was a stranger. "You didn't have to do it like this," he said. She looked back at him steadily. "Which part?" He didn't answer. He carried boxes to his car for 40 minutes and drove away without saying goodbye to Nora, who was sitting at the kitchen table coloring a picture of a horse and didn't notice he'd gone until dinner. Petra finished making pasta and sat down beside her daughter and asked about the horse. What came after wasn't clean. She wants to be honest about that. The first month was the kind of exhaustion that lives in your body, not your mind. She would finish a full day of work, pick up Nora, make dinner, read stories, do the bath, get through bedtime, and then sit on the kitchen floor with her back against the cabinets and just not move for a while. Not crying, not thinking, just existing in the quiet. Daphne brought food sometimes. Wendy took Nora on weekends without being asked. A woman at Nora's school named Claudette Walsh, whose daughter had been in Nora's class since September, started texting Petra on Tuesday mornings to ask if she needed a pickup for school drop-off. And Petra said yes 3 times and then started saying yes automatically, and eventually they were having coffee on the front porch on Saturday mornings while the kids played in the yard, and Petra realized she'd made a friend without trying to. She hadn't done that in years. She hadn't had time. She'd been busy being smaller. Garrett got a lawyer. A good one. Someone from a firm downtown with a reputation for aggressive family law strategy. His name was Philip Harmer, and he had the energy of a man who enjoyed the sound of his own voice in a courtroom. The first mediation session did not go well. Harmer came in with a position that Garrett had evidently been building for weeks. That Petra was unstable, that she had removed herself and the child from the family home without communication. That her mental health had been a concern for some time. He had a letter from a doctor, a GP Garrett had apparently consulted twice, suggesting she had exhibited signs of anxiety and emotional volatility. Petra sat very still and let him finish. Then she opened her folder. Russell had coached her not to lay everything out at once. Don't give them the whole picture in the first session. Let them think they know what you have. Then show them what they missed. She showed them 3 things that day. The financial transfer records, $42,000, moved in increments from their joint accounts over 8 months. Garrett's signature on the authorization forms, her name absent from all of them. Harmer's composure didn't break, exactly, but something in it shifted, like a table with a leg that wasn't quite level, imperceptible until it moved. Garrett's face did something more complicated. He looked at the documents and then he looked at her, and for the first time in as long as she could remember, he looked uncertain. She'd spent years chasing his certainty, trying to match it, wondering what was wrong with her that she could never quite keep up. Watching it slip was not satisfying in the way she thought it might be. It was just true. These will require explanation, Harmer said carefully. Yes, Russell agreed. They will. The weeks that followed were the kind of grinding, procedural work that nobody shows you when they tell the story later. Disclosure packages, counter affidavits, emails that had to be parsed for tone before sending. A financial audit that Garrett's team tried to delay twice before the judge issued an order. Petra went to work. She made lunches. She sat on the porch with Claudette Walsh on Saturday mornings. She started running again, something she'd given up when Nora was born and never gotten back to. Just around the neighborhood at 6 a.m., in the blue-gray early light when it was still quiet. She wasn't training for anything. She just needed something that was only hers. There was a Tuesday morning in November when she was standing in the kitchen, making Nora's lunch, and her phone buzzed with an email from Russell's office, and she opened it and read it once, and then stood there with a piece of bread in her hand and cried. Not the way she'd cried in the shower that first night, differently. Like something that had been held at a wrong angle was finally being set down. Nora appeared in the kitchen doorway in her pajamas, looking at her. "Mama, are you sad?" Petra set the bread down and crouched to Nora's level. "A little bit," she said, "but mostly I'm okay. Do you want blueberries in your lunch today or grapes?" Nora thought about this with great seriousness. Both, Petra agreed. The settlement hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday in late November. Russell had prepared her carefully. He'd walked her through every likely scenario, every argument Harmer might bring, every number on the table. She'd done this for years with client presentations, prepared so thoroughly that by the time the meeting actually happened, she could be present in it rather than braced against it. She dressed carefully that morning. Not to impress anyone, just because it mattered to her to feel like herself. The version of herself that had spent years building something real, who had managed accounts and projections and client relationships and a household and a child, who had given Garrett a foundation he'd built his confidence on and then used to climb away from her. She arrived 12 minutes early. Garrett was already in the hallway when she got there, standing with Harmer a few feet from the door. He looked different than he had at the house. Smaller, somehow, though he hadn't changed. She realized after a moment that what was different was her. She wasn't reading him the same way. She wasn't calculating his mood, bracing for his reaction, adjusting herself to the room he was taking up. She was just looking at him, a man in a hall. He looked away first. Inside, The proceeding was methodical. There was no dramatic confrontation, no moment where anyone raised their voice. What there was instead was documentation, and Petra had more of it than they did. The $42,000 in transferred funds had become, under a forensic accountant's review, a figure closer to $63,000 when additional patterns were flagged across a longer time window. Harmer tried twice to reframe this as marital financial management. The presiding officer did not appear to find this characterization persuasive. The custody arrangement was handled separately, with the focus Russell had always said it should have: the child's stability, her school, her routines, her relationship with both parents. Petra had documentation there too, not a surveillance file, nothing adversarial, just a calendar. A year's worth of school pickups, doctor's appointments, parent-teacher conferences. Who had attended each one? Garrett had been present at 4 out of 31. She hadn't kept the calendar as a weapon. She'd kept it the way she kept everything, because it was orderly, because it helped her plan, because she'd learned early in her career that the person who controlled the information controlled the conversation. She just hadn't imagined she'd need to use it this way. The officer reviewed it without comment, made a note, moved on. The terms weren't everything she'd asked for. That was reality, and Russell had prepared her for it. They were fair, more than fair in several respects. The house would be sold and the proceeds divided, but the timeline allowed her to stay until Nora finished the school year. The investment accounts were restructured. The transferred funds were addressed within the asset division in a way that Garrett's team clearly hadn't anticipated as the outcome. Garrett signed the final documents without looking at her. Harmer, to his credit, was professional in defeat. He gathered his files with the composure of a man who had lost before and knew how to leave a room. Russell walked Petra to the elevator afterward. She thanked him. He said she'd done the work, and he meant it. She stood outside on King Street for a moment, in the cold November air, watching the lunch-hour crowd move around her. Toronto in November is not beautiful. The trees are bare, and the light is flat, and people walk fast with their shoulders up against the wind. She loved it anyway. She'd always loved it. The way the city kept going, indifferent to individual disasters, moving around its own complications with the brisk efficiency of a place that has things to do. She was going to be okay. Not right away. Not without the Tuesday mornings on the kitchen floor, the strange echoing evenings, the questions from Nora that came sideways, and at unexpected moments, the long process of learning what her life looked like when she stopped building it around the shape of someone else's needs. But okay. Genuinely, solidly, in the specific and unglamorous way that real things are okay. The following spring, Nora lost her first tooth. It happened at breakfast on a Saturday, mid-bite into a piece of toast, and she shrieked loud enough that Petra knocked over her coffee reaching for her. There was a brief, chaotic minute involving a paper towel and a lot of reassurance. And then Nora held up the tooth on her palm, with the expression of someone who has completed a significant achievement. "It's tiny," she said. "They always are," Petra told her. Nora examined it. Is the tooth fairy real? Petra looked at her daughter, at the gap in her smile, the toast crumbs on her chin, the absolute seriousness with which she was waiting for the answer. "What do you think?" Petra said. Nora considered this for a long moment. "I think she's real," she said finally, "but she might be very busy." "That sounds about right," Petra said. She made a note to leave $5 under the pillow that night. She thought about her grandmother's ring in the box on the closet shelf. She thought about the projection models she was building for a new client, a woman who'd started her own consulting firm and needed someone to help her see where she was going. She thought about Claudette Walsh's porch and the coffee that was always too strong, and the particular quality of a Saturday morning in May when the neighborhood finally shook off winter and everything smelled like new grass. She thought, "I built something once without knowing what I was building. I can do it again, this time on purpose." Nora was still looking at her, tooth on palm, waiting. Petra smiled. "Let's find a good box to keep it in."